Welcome to the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. Real inspiration for real innovators. If you're looking for innovation and leadership transformation, your journey starts now.
Welcome to the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Born. Look, if you're enjoying innovation insights, don't forget to hit subscribe so that you never miss a future episode. By staying at the forefront of trends and real-world examples that impact today's innovators, we want you to follow us at Innovation Meets Leadership. Well, I'm really excited today. We have a special treat for you. We've got Scott Hutcheson. He's a PhD biosocial scientist. You're going to learn what that means in a second. And he is a senior lecturer at Purdue University. He specializes in leadership and teams and organizational performance through the lens of biology and so much more. Welcome to the podcast, Scott.
Hey, thank you for having me, Natalie.
Well, I'd love for you to take a moment. You have such a cool background, and I can't do it justice in a bio. I thought it would be really interesting to kick off by just exploring a little bit of your background, because I myself, when I was reading your bio, I was like, I'd like to know about some of these twists and turns in your career and some of the things you've done.
So actually, I'm a professor at Purdue University, and this is the first week of classes. So it struck me that this is my 31st fall start at Purdue. Those first few were as a doctoral student, and I decided to stick around, or they asked me to stick around. So it's been a long time. But a few years before I decided on that PhD, I had become really interested in how organizations perform and maybe not perform up to their expectations, despite being super well-resourced, seemingly talented people. Yet, you hear that statistic that 70% of the time some sort of transformation effort fails.
Yes.
Right? So I experienced that early in my career. I won't go into that story, but it got me really, really curious about organizational performance and how the leaders within that organization impact that performance. So that kind of set me on the path that I've really been on ever since. And so for all that time, I've had one foot inside the university, but I've also maintained one foot outside the university, working with both executive leaders and emerging and high potential leaders in my classrooms, but then out there in the real world too. So worked with organizations of all size, from tiny little startups or mom and pop kinds of businesses to really big kind of global firms. And it's been a fun few years to learn what works and what doesn't. And so that's a little bit about how I kind of came to this work.
Well, and just fascinating. You've worked with hundreds of organizations right over this time, including the White House and thousands of leaders. And so I think the treat for us today is that you're going to take this knowledge that you've amassed over all this time and bring it to this audience so that we can learn a little bit more about biohacking leadership. You've written a lot of articles on this topic. And so I think we just need to start with, what is it and what inspired you to actually begin to write on this topic?
Yeah, so really it was kind of two streams of events that sort of intersected with one another a few years ago. So let's kind of start with my approach to leadership teams and organizations. So I'm a biosocial scientist. I'm trained as a social scientist, but my approach to the work that I do has always been more rooted in biology. Our behavior has evolved just like our genetics. So there's a reason why we live much longer than human beings did a few millennia ago, but there's also a reason why we can come together formally or informally in groups and do like really amazing things, build companies, create community. So I was always interested in that from a biology kind of perspective. But then the other stream actually was a personal one. About 5 years ago, I got a diabetes diagnosis. It was kind of one of those things that was, for the last few years, it was probably more a matter of when, not if, because every year my physical, my A1C would go up a little bit, and there was diabetes in my family. 5 years ago, I crossed that threshold. So I really got serious and said, I want to understand this disease, if you will, and I want to understand how my own personal behavior can impact, my numbers, if you will. So I didn't yet consider myself a biohacker, and I don't know that I ever did, but I did a lot of the things that biohackers do. So traditionally, biohacking is about kind of improving your own personal performance for longevity reasons or quality of life reasons. And Natalie, to be honest, there's a lot of junk science out there under the biohacking umbrella, but there's some really good stuff too. So I leaned into the good stuff. I got a continuous glucose monitor. I began to make full use of my smartwatch. So I had means of data.
Yeah.
And that allowed me to do some experimentation in real time. So we all know like what you eat impacts your blood sugar, but also how much rest you get, how you manage stress, and your exercise. So I got to experiment in real time and see, all right, these daily tweaks I might be able to make to my behavior, is that impacting what's going on inside my body? And I found that it was. So I'm happy to share I'm in what they call diabetes remission. So my
That's awesome.
A1C levels are back down to normal levels. And so it was kind of those two things came into play, and perfect timing. My publisher, Wiley, I published a book with him a few years ago, just kind of dropped an email and said, "Hey, you working on anything new?" And I said, "Well, I've kind of got this idea. What about biohacking leadership, biohacking teams, and biohacking organizations?" So I was pretty bold. I pitched a 3-book series, and they said, "Hey, let's write all 3." So we started with biohacking leadership. And so what that is it takes that biology behavior approach to how a leader performs, the signals that they send to others to help them create shared value together, right? And so the idea of biohacking leadership was born. So I started to do the research and folded it into my practice. And that's where that came from.
That's so fascinating. And I love the trajectory of the story of just how you got from here to there. And I'm wondering, when we think about, like you said, biohacking, you can kind of relate it to your health, but it's really about performance, right? It's the true overall performance of a human. How do you relate it specifically to leadership? So when you apply it to a leader, what does that end up looking like?
Yeah. A few years ago, I was asked by a corporate client if I would be interested in doing some training in executive presence. Now, some of your listeners may know of that term. I was familiar with it, but I hadn't spent a lot of time thinking about it or looking into it. And so, for those of you that may not be familiar with it, executive presence is how you kind of show up as a leader. And I always perceived of it as being kind of shallow, and you had to have natural charisma, or I think our stereotypical models of what a leader looks like, sounds like, was really limited. So I looked into the literature. I'm an academic, right? And I found that it really has not been researched or well documented as to what it really even is.
Wow.
So I kind of broke the two terms apart, executive and presence. And so executive, we use that word to describe a particular level in an organization, in the C-suite, but it came from kind of neuroscience and psychology, the executive functions of the brain, those strategic thinking skills that don't come online fully until we're in about our mid-20s. Son's that age, and believe me, it is so nice to see those starting to come online. So we want the people at the top of our organization to be strategic thinkers and problem solvers and understanding nuance and have full use of the executive functions of their brain. But there's a problem. No one can see how you think. So they only get an idea of how you think through your presence.
Yeah.
So through the way in which you show up, your verbal and nonverbal communication, your actions, your behavior.
Yeah.
So with some of my graduate students, we began to research the behavioral signals that when others see them say, that seems to be someone capable of leading. And then with consistent use of those signals, we see that it impacts the way in which they perform as a leader in their teams and their organizations. So really for the first time, we took a scientific approach to this vague notion of executive presence and created a new model that we call leadership biodynamics. These signals, and we identified like 18 of them.
Wow.
When we as individuals are kind of sampling from a behavioral stream, whether we're deciding who we want to pull the lever for in the voting booth, or
Mhm.
we might want to work with, or even at the team level, how we decide that's a person I'm interested in following, or maybe not. So,
Yeah.
so that's what we've developed really over the last couple of years, and that's what the book starts to describe for folks.
Wow, so there's 18. I'm wondering, could we dive into one?
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
So they're not 18 random signals. I call them biomarkers. I
Mhm.
was continuing to draw inspiration from my blood panel,
Yeah. Yeah.
A1C and my cholesterol and all that. And so I think of them as these biomarkers,
Yeah.
and they're 18, but they cluster in three kind of clumps. And 6 of them align with the overall signaling of warmth.
Mm.
Right? And then 6 of them cluster around the overall signal of competence.
Yeah.
And then the last 6 cluster around the overall signal of gravitas.
Yeah.
If I can quickly kind of define those
Yeah.
three.
Let's do it.
Yeah. I mean, warmth, we use that word a lot to describe people, but it's kind of weird because we're all 98.6, give or take a degree or two, or something's wrong. But we know what interpersonal warmth looks like. It's how we connect with other people.
Yeah.
So an effective leader is someone that we want to connect with. We sense a connection with them. They connect
Mhm.
easily with others. And then that kind of creates the conduit for what comes next. And then next is competence. We want a leader who has some sort of competence in the form of deep expertise or knowledge or experience. So we want to learn from them, right? They know something that we know about the world or about our industry or whatever,
Mhm.
what have you, or about just how to manage your workload, if you will.
Yeah.
And then the third, that's the one that needs a little bit more explanation because it's kind of an old school term as well, gravitas.
Mhm.
So gravitas, for most of us, we think of like heaviness or seriousness. And there's an element to that.
Yeah.
But there's a missing element for most of us. And we have Sir Isaac Newton to blame for that because it was a word to describe people long before he used it to describe the law of gravity. So
Wow.
when the apple fell to the tree, he said,
Mhm.
law of gravity.
Mhm.
But the ancient definition, there are a few, but my favorite is a poetic one. And a person with gravitas was said to have their feet firmly planted on the ground, but with angel's wings ready to take flight.
That's cool. I
So
like.
it's heavy, but not too heavy.
Yeah.
I love the planetary definition. So our planet has one moon, right? But others have more than one. So we pulled that body into our orbit, right? But we didn't pull it completely into us, right? To
Right.
create another Grand Canyon. We channeled its initial inertia. So gravitas for me in this definition is somebody with gravitas has the ability to pull people together,
Mhm.
create shared value.
Wow.
So warmth, competence, and gravitas, that's the formula for leadership presence or executive presence.
That is so fascinating. And, I love some of the pieces that you talk about on Gravitas. It's actually a talk I do on Gravitas for sales teams. And it was really enjoyable to hear your perspective on it. And you've given me some things to think about that I've never thought about before around that. And so very, very interesting. But also these three areas are very practical. And when you break them down further, you actually understand how you build back up to executive presence, for example. Oftentimes, and I can think about a couple of years ago when I was having conversation with an employee and I asked them to have more executive presence. And the next day they came dressed up and I thought, man, that was not what I meant. And so
Right,
you're right. There's, if you can break it down to these levels, people now understand how they can win, how they can grow,
right.
where to biohack, if you will, because now they're getting more language to maybe some things that they didn't understand before. They just thought it meant dressing nicer, which is,
Yeah.
yeah, maybe it's a part of executive presence, but it is not executive presence to dress nicer. There's so much more that goes into that, and I love that you broke that down for us.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's been fun to do this work, and what we've really created is kind of a diagnostics framework. So remember, there's these 18 biomarkers, and we've actually developed a validated assessment where
Mhm.
a leader can kind of evaluate themselves on these 18 behaviors, but then they can also get feedback from others to get their take on how they're signaling those behaviors consistently or maybe not. And then you have really something actionable. You can say, well, I'm not quite as competent as I thought I was.
Yeah.
So what are the signals that I can strengthen? So then you can go to those 16 signals or those 18 signals and see, where am I falling short, either in my own estimation or somebody else's? And then we provide, both in the book and in my practice, we provide kind of evidence-based practices for how you can kind of amp up those signals to change your own behavior, or sometimes you may have the behavior, but other people aren't sensing it.
I actually would love to talk about that a little bit more. I mean, as you look at these markers, these biomarkers, and you think to yourself, man, I feel like I'm doing this. I feel like I've mastered this area, if you will. However, it's not being communicated that way to my peers or my upline. They don't sense it. What is your recommendation on where to start?
What we typically advise is whether you're actually taking this diagnostics or not, or you're just reading the book and recognizing some things in your own practice, or if you reflect back on maybe feedback you've gotten in your evaluations or whatever, that's a good indicator. And remember, we talked about no one can see how you think. So I might be a really good strategic thinker,
Mm-hmm.
but it's just not translating well to others. So you can look and say, well, what are others not seeing? So one of the things that for that one in particular, we talk about narrating your thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you come to a meeting and you've been asked to propose an idea and you just propose the idea. Well, what people might not understand is you have spent weeks doing the research and throwing some things in and throwing some things out until you have this nugget. And you know more about it than anybody else. So you don't necessarily have time to tell everyone everything that you know, but just narrate your thinking. Now, first of all, let me tell you how I arrived at this recommendation. I took a look at best practices and whittled them down, and I considered our own culture. And in the end, I feel strongly that this is the direction that we should go.
Mm-hmm.
But you've kind of backed that up with how you think. So that's one way in which you can kind of amplify those signals that other people are taking in, because again, they don't know how you think.
I really appreciate that because, in different leadership rooms, someone coming in with a conclusion can kind of create some stress or frustration or whatever you want to call it in the room.
Right.
And so the person actually walking through their thought, and I do a lot of different instruments, and everyone thinks differently. And so if you don't bring the background of how you arrived, there are a certain group of people that you're completely leaving out, that they're stuck there.
Right.
Because they don't know that you spent, 5 weeks researching, narrowed it, and then narrowed it again to get there. And they're thinking, what is this, like a gut reaction to to this problem and how you're going to solve it? And so the narrating your thinking is brilliant, because I think a lot of people just think, well, I mean, of course I did the work. But if
Right.
you don't tell them, they don't know.
Yeah. The other thing we lean into in this practice is helping leaders understand what a huge impact they have on kind of the neurochemicals of what's flowing through the bodies of those they lead.
Hmm.
So a leader can spike cortisol with just a hastily written email,
Yes.
or just a look that doesn't match what they say. But a leader can also spike oxytocin. So that's where you lean into warmth. So I call this leadership biodynamics, because they really are these three channels of warmth,
Mhm.
competence, and gravitas. And we help leaders understand that in a particular context, I might lead with one of those versus another,
Yeah.
or I might kind of dial one down. They don't all have to be tuned up to 11, to use
Mhm.
a Spinal Tap analogy for any of our listeners that might remember that scene. You don't have to turn all of them up to 11, but a sequence that is kind of go-to for me, and it has great value in all human relationships, I think, is to lead with warmth,
Mhm.
right? And then offer something of competence. And then with gravitas, say, what can we do together?
Mm.
I open those channels of communication with warmth. I share some of my competence, but then I ask for some of your competence.
Hmm.
And then we wrap that thing up with, wow, we've found a really interesting pathway that we can take together, right? And here's how we can move forward together to try something new or to initiate a different approach to something that's not working.
Yeah, I want to maybe label in the design thinking world what you said as well as a form of co-creation,
Mhm.
where you're inviting other people to the table, you're inviting other voices to the table, and you're inviting people to be a part of the conversation. And therefore, it doesn't feel like this idea is happening to me.
Right.
It feels like I have a seat at the table and I'm helping to add to it, to subtract from it, to help build on it, to take
Yeah.
it where it needs to go. And to me, that for me, as somebody who comes from a product development background, is a form of warmth when
Absolutely.
someone asks my opinion, "Well, what do you think?" Or, "Where what how can we build on this idea?" And I think we sometimes forget, and your model, I think, speaks to it, underlines it, and underscores how important it is to co-create with people because people want to feel heard, they wanna feel known, and so you bring that into preview is exactly what we do in the design thinking world. We take an idea, we put it out on the table, and we say, "Let's build."
Yeah. I love an insight that comes from kind of consumer behavior. So most of us have experience putting together a piece of IKEA furniture.
Mhm.
And there's something called the IKEA effect.
Yeah.
You know, none of us are passing on IKEA furniture as an heirloom. It's not going to last forever. That's not what we buy it for. And it's relatively inexpensive in the landscape of furniture, if you will, or home furnishings.
Mhm.
But we value it more when we had a hand in putting it together.
That's right.
So whether it's a change agenda or whether it's a product, people will value it more if they have helped co-create it, rather than just being handed this and say, go sell that.
Yeah.
Or this is how we are changing inside our organization. We decided that way up here, and now it's your turn to execute that. So that co-creation creates that IKEA effect. This is not yours, it is ours.
Yeah. What are some other ways? I mean, I think co-creation and what we're talking about here is a big way that improves team performance, releases the oxytocin that we're talking about. What are some other ways that this model impacts teams as well?
Yeah. I work not exclusively, but a lot of my work is with scientists, engineers, and technologists. So I'm embedded in a very engineering centric sort of school. So the emerging leaders and high potential leaders that I often work with, whether in the classroom or outside of it, have tons of competence. Right? I mean, I literally work in organizations where you may be literally the world expert
Yeah.
on this kind of narrow
Mhm.
aspect of the human experience or the natural world. So lots and lots of competence, sometimes not a lot of warmth. So often we are helping leaders amp up their warmth to so that their competence can land better. I remember for years I served as faculty for something called the Mandela Washington Fellowship for Young African Leaders, where we bring young African leaders to the US. And most of them are scientists, engineers doing really cool stuff. And a lot of them are entrepreneurial as well. So I remember working with this one young man who had a technology, pretty low cost technology for water purification. Man, he knew his science, he knew the specs, he could talk day and night. And one day over lunch, I said, hey, man, I don't think I've ever asked you, why this? Why
Mhm.
water technology?
Yeah.
Curious, what's your origin story? And he told this remarkable story about this place where he grew up in Africa, and he and his brother used to drink from the stream all the time when they'd be playing outside. And then one day they both got sick.
Ah,
And he got better pretty quickly, just thought it was a bug, but his brother like almost died. And
wow.
it turns out that the water had been contaminated. And I'm like, why are you not telling that as part of your story?
Mhm.
Well, I'm a scientist. And I said, yeah, but you're a person, you're a human being, and those that you're pitching funding opportunities to are human beings. Let's start weaving that into your story. So a little bit of warmth. Everybody, if you didn't have a little brother, you can imagine what it would be like to have one. And
Yeah.
have that formative experience and say, I'm going to make sure that doesn't happen to other people's little brothers. My gosh, the checks started being written once he added that little piece to it. So, recognizing that it is not just our technical competence, but we are all working with human beings.
Wow. I love that. What a powerful story and a great place to land. How can people find you? Like how can people find you, follow you? When are these books coming out so we can get our hands on them? Tell us more.
Yeah, so Biohacking Leadership came out July 17th, so it's
Okay.
just been a month.
Congratulations.
So thank you. And it is available from all the online retailers that you might imagine. And the next book is Biohacking Teams, Leveraging the Biology of Behavior for Peak Performance. I'm happy to say I finished a first draft of that just last week.
Wow.
So it will be out July of next year.
Okay.
And then Biohacking Organizations, July of 2026.
Wow.
So kind of that's the trajectory of when those books will hit the streets. In terms of where you can find me, if you can spell my last name right, you can find me just with a simple Google. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. When you're associated with a university like Purdue, which supposedly has the best brand recognition globally of any university.
Wow, that's awesome. I didn't know that.
So I'm highly Googleable because I'm part of Purdue. So yeah, you can find me on Instagram, LinkedIn, on my Purdue page, but then also scotthutcheson.com is kind of where I set up my now open sign for the world.
That's awesome. Well, Dr. Scott Hutcheson, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Natalie.
Well, to our listeners, thank you for joining the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. Remember, don't just get out of the box, break the box and set it on fire. Let's go transform something.
Thank you for joining us for the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. Be sure to subscribe to our show on iTunes. Follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Innovation Meets Leadership, and visit our site at innovationmeetsleadership.com for more innovation resources.
Hey, my new book is out, Set It on Fire, The Art of Innovation. Click on the link to learn more. And don't just get out of the box, break the box and set it on fire. Let's go transform something.